Welcome to the EBPOT podcast with your host, Kim Griffin. Hi everyone and welcome to the EBPOT podcast. I'm your host, Kim Griffin. I'm a paediatric occupational therapist currently based in London. I launched the EBPOT podcast to make it easy for children's OTs to stay up to date with recently published evidence. This week the topic is executive functions. In the same way that there is no one conceptualization of self-regulation, something that I discussed in episode 10, there's also multiple conceptualizations of the term executive functions. Today we'll explore them with a specific focus on how they are conceptualized within occupational therapy. If you want the article references, head over to ebpot.com. The link to the website is in the show notes. Subscribers will have also already received the link to the show notes on the day that the episode was released. The main article we're covering today is titled, How does occupational therapy literature conceptualize executive functions and how this influences occupational therapy assessment and integrative review? It's by Heaps and it was published in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy in 2025. This integrative review aimed to explore the conceptual understanding of executive function in occupational therapy literature and how this influences the profession's approach to assessment of executive functions. The researcher chose to explore this topic because scoping reviews had previously noted inconsistency and variation in both the physiological mechanisms and components of executive function due to lack of agreement in research. And secondly, because they had evidence from a survey of 663 occupational therapists that found that executive function was rarely addressed by these therapists and only 1% used specific performance-based assessments, and many were continuing to use impairment-focused assessments that were not designed to specifically assess executive function. The researcher used an integrative review methodology and followed the PRISMA guidance to ensure rigor. The population included was adults with acquired brain injury, and they excluded mental health-based studies from pediatrics, and elderly or dementia patients. 13 papers were ultimately included in the final review. 11 of these were studies and 2 of them were book chapters. An adapted version of the CASP checklists were used to formalize the process of quality checking. For synthesizing the evidence, the meta-analysis using the Atlas TI software was employed, and it was combined with reflexive journaling to identify themes and patterns across the dataset. When the authors analysed the 13 articles, they generated 3 different themes. It does say 4 in the abstract, but there's only 3 reported in the article as the abstract repeats one of the themes. Theme 1 was titled Inconsistency in the OT Literature on a Working Definition of Executive Function and Its Components. So of the 13 sources reviewed, 6 explicitly defined executive function. However, none of these shared a common definition and all sourced their definitions from neuropsychological literature rather than occupational therapy specific frameworks. A shared theme across 4 studies was conceptualization of executive functions as a group of interrelated cognitive components with terms like integrative cognitive skills or interplay of components. In contrast, other studies characterized executive functions as cognitive processes enabling behaviors like initiation, organization, and planning. The absence of a unified definition contributed to a proliferation of different executive function components. Among the 13 studies, a total of 42 executive function components were identified. Planning emerged as the most frequently cited component, appearing in 8 of the studies, followed by problem-solving in 6, organization in 5, initiation in 5, inhibition in 4, and judgment also in 4. Additionally, 28 components were idiosyncratic, being identified in only a single study. Semantic overlaps were evident throughout. For example, goal setting was identified in 3 studies, with variations like goal formation in 2 studies and establishment of purposeful goals in another. Self-monitoring was described as both a distinct component and in the context of verifying goal attainment. Planning was described both as a key component or as the ability to determine effective strategies to facilitate goal attainment. An extended semantic analysis by the researcher grouped semantically similar components, but this still resulted in a list of 21 components, and challenges remained in defining what constitutes an executive function component and whether these represent behaviours or cognitive processes. Theme number 2 is executive function conceptualised in singular complex tasks in the OT literature. The term complex and novel are frequently used to describe occupations that activate executive function, appearing 83 and 38 times respectively across the 13 studies. 5 studies discuss how executive function impairment compromises ability to manage complex activities. However, there's no consensus on defining what a complex activity actually is. The most commonly cited complex tasks included managing finances in 4 studies, followed by shopping and work in 3 studies each. Other tasks mentioned included cooking, planning an event, washing, dressing, making coffee, and driving. Interestingly, some studies conceptualize executive function as responding not only to complex tasks, but also novel situations requiring adaptation, whilst others present a more simplified view linking executive function primarily to specific tasks. A consistent issue was the absence of a clear, unified occupational therapy definition of what constitutes a complex activity. Most references to complexity are drawn from the neuropsychological literature rather than occupational science. Many descriptions remained ambiguous, for example, defining complexity as a task spanning a long duration, or occurring in a dynamic environment without specifying exactly what these terms mean. Theme number 3 was there is uncertainty on how normal executive function performance is characterized in function. The research reviewed highlighted that clinicians felt there was a need for a better characterization of normal executive function performance to accurately interpret assessments. This reflects broader uncertainty regarding when executive function is activated in complex occupations. Clinicians often relied on subjective interpretations of efficient performance rather than using their objective error-based assessments. The lack of clarity surrounding what constitutes normal executive function performance is likely due to the scarcity of literature on how executive function components manifest in real-world contexts, particularly when impairments are present. Without universal definition or agreement, interpretation then also becomes subjective. Of the 21 executive functions identified in the thematic analysis, 10 lack functional descriptions in the literature. Only 2 studies provided functional descriptions of any executive function component, while 7 sources offer no insight into how components present in functional contexts. In the studies that did provide functional descriptions, most relied on the neuropsychological literature, typically from lab-based settings. There were 2 studies which provided some insight into executive function-related performance, but both had significant limitations with small sample sizes, lack of control groups, or being single case studies, so it made the results difficult to generalize. So what are our practical takeaways? Essentially, for school-based occupational therapists, this review reveals some sobering truths about how our profession conceptualizes and assesses executive function. The findings suggest we're working with inconsistent definitions borrowed from neuropsychology and an overwhelming proliferation of component terms that overlap semantically and assessment approaches that may not accurately capture the complexity of real-world occupational performance. I'm finding a very similar pattern in my own PhD work on self-regulation, another term with many differing conceptualizations within the literature. The lack of clarity has practical implications for assessment. If we're conceptualizing executive functions only as interaction between components, we might be able to identify presence or absence of executive function, but we cannot accurately conceptualize how it will impact occupational performance in context. This integrative review was conducted by a single researcher as part of a master's thesis, and this introduces certain limitations. The absence of a second researcher to verify thematic analysis may have resulted in some bias or overlooked some studies, reducing internal validity. Despite efforts to retrieve all relevant literature, there's always a risk of missing pertinent studies, particularly those published in languages other than English, and also the exclusion of non-English literature may have limited the breadth of perspectives. Despite these limitations, the review challenges us to think more critically about how we conceptualize and assess executive function in our practice. It highlights the urgent need for clearer occupational therapy specific definitions that align with occupational science, better frameworks for creating ecologically valid assessments, and greater focus on personally meaningful occupations rather than generic tests. Without addressing these gaps, we risk assessments that don't accurately reflect real-world impact of executive dysfunction on our students' occupational performance. If you're enjoying the EBPOT podcast, don't forget to join the mailing list. You can do this at ebpot.com. Subscribers get the episode notes sent straight to their inbox each fortnight. So there's 2 supporting articles this week. The first is titled Enhancing Executive Control in Early Childhood, Educators' Implementation of the Pedagogical Occupational Executive Training Program. It was published in Physical and Occupational Therapy in Paediatrics by Frisk in 2025. This was a feasibility study of 11 early childhood teachers implementing the POET-T, so the Pedagogical Occupational Executive Training Program, in mainstream classrooms. POET-T is a consultation-based occupational therapy intervention to enhance children's executive control in education settings. The program is delivered over a 6-week period and showed high acceptance, fidelity, and implementation. There was also an improvement in children's ability to manage daily routines. The second article is titled Examining the Triad of Sensory Processing, ADHD Symptoms and Executive Functioning in Adults with ADHD, Evidence from a Multi-Assessment Measure. It was published in the Journal of Affective Disorders in 2026, and it's by Schultz and colleagues. This is one of those studies of adults that I do think has some implications for children, which is why I've included it. It was a study of 40 adults with ADHD and 39 controls, and they examined the interactions between sensory processing patterns, ADHD symptoms, and executive function performance. The results showed executive function alterations in ADHD and pointed to a potential role of sensory processing in modulating executive function. However, the interactions did not remain significant after correction for multiple testing was made, so the overall results were unfortunately inconclusive. Thanks for listening today. Remember, you can also check out the show notes or book a live journal club or other training at ebpot.com. I'll be back in 2 weeks with an article covering menstruation among autistic adults. There's some really useful applications in it for our autistic teenagers. I'll see you then, and remember to share the EBPOT podcast with another pediatric OT colleague so they can listen and learn as well. This podcast provides educational commentary and analysis of recent research for continuing professional development. All studies are properly cited and used under the fair use provisions for educational purposes. Listeners should consult the original sources for complete study details.